I want to start with a sentence that sounds simple, almost harmless. We love America. It sounds like unity. It sounds like pride. It sounds like something no one could object to. But history teaches us something uncomfortable. The most dangerous ideas often arrive wearing the language of virtue. I love America too. But not as a slogan, not as a loyalty test, and certainly not as a demand for silence. When a news organization feels the need to announce its love for the country unapologetically, we should pause. Journalism is supposed to question power, not pledge affection to it. My country, right or wrong, is not patriotism. It's a binary, and binaries flatten reality. If you care about democracy, you should be suspicious of anything that reduces love of country to one approved posture. Because once love becomes performative, dissent becomes betrayal. If this kind of analysis matters to you, stay with me. Because to understand what's happening now, we need to ask a harder question next. What does loving America actually mean? And that takes us to the real problem underneath the slogan. Let's be precise, because precision is what slogans erase. When people say we love America, they rarely mean the same thing. Some are defending democratic norms, others are defending power. And many are reacting emotionally to a caricature of the left that's been inflated far beyond its real influence. Yes, there is a loud fringe that sees America as irredeemable, that treats its history as original sin without redemption, that reduces people to categories and justifies excess in the name of justice. Voters rejected that worldview in 2024, decisively, but here's the problem. The backlash didn't stop there. Criticism of far-left activists metastasized into something broader, a rejection of criticism itself, a culture where questioning authority is recast as hatred, where skepticism is framed as disloyalty, where love of country becomes conditional, granted only if you agree. That's the sleight of hand, a false choice between blind loyalty and total condemnation. And once that choice is accepted, the guardrails start to weaken quietly. To understand how we got here, we need to step back and look at the deeper historical pattern behind this moment. This tension isn't new. America has always oscillated between self-correction and self-mythology. At its best, the country confronts its contradictions: slavery, racism, exclusion. Not to wallow in guilt, but to expand the promise. That's how civil rights grew. That's how liberties widened. Progress came not from denial, but from reckoning. But there's another cycle. When power feels threatened by social change, by demographic shifts, by criticism, the instinct is to retreat into nostalgia, to declare the nation already perfect, to frame history itself as an attack. That's when education becomes dangerous, words become suspect, and complexity becomes divisive. We've seen this before. Periods of rapid change produce moral panic. The response is simplification, loyalty tests, enemies within. It's easier to ban uncomfortable truths than to teach them. The irony is painful. The very act of confronting America's worst chapters proved its strength. Yet now, that process is recast as betrayal. And once a society decides reflection is weakness, it becomes vulnerable to something far more corrosive. Because crises don't begin with tanks. They begin with ideas. The first real rupture doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives as normalization. In 2024, Americans didn't just reject the excesses of the far left. They voted back a man who had already tested the outer limits of democratic restraint, a man who attempted to stay in power after losing an election, a man whose behavior in any other era would have ended a political career. Instead, it was absorbed. That was the mini crisis, not because of a single vote, but because of what followed, the collective decision to move on, to treat unprecedented actions as mere background noise, to downgrade alarms into partisan whining. Fear played its role. So did fatigue. and so did a media environment that found it easier to frame this moment as cultural theater than institutional stress. If you've ever wondered how democracies erode without collapsing, this is how. The line doesn't snap, it bends, again and again. If this analysis resonates, pause for a moment and think about why so much of this feels familiar and why it's happening faster now. Because beneath the spectacle, there's a deeper system at work, and that's what we need to unpack next. What makes this moment so dangerous isn't chaos, it's structure. Authoritarian drift doesn't require jackboots. It runs on incentives, on loyalty rewarded and restraint punished, on institutions hollowed out, not by force, but by precedent. Once power learns it can ignore norms without consequence, it will. Once leaders see that accusations can replace evidence, they stop bothering with proof. Once lies work, truth becomes optional. This is the hidden mechanism. A system where binaries do the work of enforcement. Love versus hate, patriot versus traitor, us versus them. Complexity becomes a liability. In that system, billionaires amplify fear to millions with a single post. Officials borrow the language of ethnic threat and make it sound administrative. Agencies are repurposed not to protect rights, but to demonstrate dominance. Each move, on its own, can be rationalized. Together, they form a machine, one that rewards escalation and punishes restraint. And once that machine is running, it doesn't need ideology anymore. It only needs momentum. The next rupture doesn't come from theory. It comes from impact. And that's where things accelerate. The second rupture is where abstraction turns physical. Policies stop being debates and start becoming bodies. Institutions stop being ideas and start showing up at your door. This is the moment when power tests how far it can go, not rhetorically, but operationally. You see it when the executive branch treats the Constitution as optional, when military force is used without consultation, when sovereignty becomes negotiable, when efficiency is elevated above legality, and speed replaces deliberation. You see it when soft power is dismissed as weakness, when programs that cost little but save millions of lives are dismantled casually, not because they failed, but because empathy no longer fits the brand. You see it when racial language, once confined to the fringes, is repeated by people at the center, when it's reposted, liked, normalized, when phrases that echo Europe's darkest decades are spoken without shame and without consequence. This is the second mini-crisis, because once the state signals that restraint is no longer sacred, the damage doesn't stay abstract for long. And that brings this moment home. Now let me make this personal, because this is where systems stop being theoretical. If you're watching this, you're not thinking in terms of institutions. You're thinking about safety, about fairness, about whether the rules will still protect you when you need them. In the America I love, you don't have to worry about masked agents dragging people away without due process. You don't have to wonder whether citizenship actually shields you. You don't have to calculate whether your speech, your activism, or your identity puts you at risk. But when power learns, it can act first and justify later. Uncertainty becomes the atmosphere you breathe. Fear becomes ambient, and people adjust quietly by speaking less, trusting less, expecting less. That's how freedom erodes in daily life. Not with announcements, with normalization. If this feels unsettling, it should, because democracy isn't lost all at once. It's lost when ordinary people stop expecting it to work. If you believe this conversation matters, don't disengage, share it, sit with it, talk about it. Because what happens next doesn't depend only on leaders. It depends on whether people still care. And the consequences don't stop at the border. What's happening inside America never stays inside America. For decades, US power wasn't just measured in weapons or GDP. It was measured in legitimacy, in alliances, in the belief, sometimes flawed, often incomplete, that America stood for a rules-based order rather than raw dominance. That belief is fragile. When the United States ignores international norms, others take notes. When it treats sovereignty as optional, Smaller countries stop trusting guarantees. When it signals that might makes right, rivals don't feel constrained, they feel licensed. Soft power collapses quietly. Aid programs vanish. Moral authority erodes. And into those vacuums step warlords, autocrats, and revisionist powers who don't pretend to care about rights at all. Allies recalibrate. Institutions weaken. The global system becomes more transactional, more cynical, more dangerous. This isn't abstract geopolitics. It's a chain reaction. Refugee flows, regional instability, conflicts that spread because no one believes the rules will be enforced. When America abandons restraint, the world doesn't become freer. It becomes harsher. And that leaves us with one unavoidable question. Where does this trajectory actually lead? History rarely gives us certainty, but it does give us patterns. From here, there are three plausible paths forward, not predictions, but trajectories. The first is renewal. Institutions reassert themselves. Courts matter again. Norms regain force because enough people decide they still care. Power is constrained not by goodwill, but by resistance. This path doesn't require perfection. It requires accountability and patience. The second is managed decline. Democracy survives, but thinner. Elections continue, but norms are selectively enforced. Rights exist, but unevenly. Fear coexists with routine. Life goes on, just more cautiously. This is how many democracies fade without formally dying. The third path is darker. The binary hardens. Power centralizes. Violence becomes normalized as policy. Due process becomes conditional. Once crossed, these lines are rarely uncrossed. Systems built on fear don't self-correct. They escalate. None of these paths are inevitable. They're shaped by choices, elite choices, yes, but also public tolerance, what people excuse, what they normalize, what they stop resisting. Because democracy isn't sustained by love of country as a slogan. It's sustained by vigilance. And that brings us to the final question, the one that matters most. Loving a country is not the same as defending everything it does. Real patriotism is harder than slogans. It requires holding two truths at once: pride and shame, gratitude and anger, hope and fear. You don't get to choose only the comforting parts. The America I love is not perfect. It never was. But it was built on an idea radical for its time that power should be constrained, questioned, corrected, that leaders answer to the law, that citizens are not subjects. When We Love America becomes a shield for power, it stops being love. When criticism is treated as betrayal, democracy is already in trouble. And when force replaces persuasion, the idea itself begins to hollow out. You don't protect a country by pretending it's flawless. You protect it by refusing to lie about what it's becoming. So here's the real test. Not whether you say you love America, but whether you're willing to defend the principles that make it worth loving even when it's uncomfortable, even when it costs you, even when the crowd moves the other way. If this analysis gave you clarity, don't let it end here. Share it, talk about it, stay engaged, because the future of America won't be decided by slogans. It will be decided by what people are willing to confront next.